So we're good? All right, excellent. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. You are now engaged in the integrated security approach and enabled by IRM and SecOps, hosted by KPMG. My name is Daniel Garner.
I'm Issa Farouk.
And you have the clicker, right? There we go. There it goes. Okay. A couple of the freestanding statements there. So quick introduction for me. I am a director at KPMG, been with the firm for about 8 years now, within the cyber defense and cyber practice group, concentrating mostly on security operations centers, and logging and monitoring, which also includes vulnerability response and vulnerability management.
So that guy up there is an imposter. This is Issa. My name is Issa Farouk. I'm a director with KPMG, specifically in our cyber GRC practice. I've been helping our clients help their overall program and vision and strategy as it relates to their integrated risk management programs. I do so by putting them in working sessions and dialogues towards helping them define their process and technical designs, leading full-scale implementations, and then essentially the overall learning and adoption of those implementations by their end users. So excited to be here and excited to be talking to you guys with our integrated approach to IRM and security operations as it relates to our client spotlight. So what we're going to be discussing with you today is giving you guys an overall view or overall background of our client. What were the key drivers for their change? Essentially why they started their transformation journey, why they leveraged ServiceNow to drive that change. We're going to talk about the governance and the underlying integrated architecture that was deployed to help them achieve their vision and achieve their implementation. We're going to talk about the charted path that we took on our journey, so the transformation journey that we undertook, talk about the path, where we started first, where we landed, and what's on their future roadmap. And then just some key takeaways. As you guys are sitting here in the audience, you guys are leaders and professionals within your organizations. This is a key topic amongst all of you all. So just some key takeaways and considerations for you all as you walk away from this presentation.
All right, so about our client. So we'll get into the case study. Our client is an energy sector client. We have basically all the particulars regarding the client here. Relatively large client, publicly owned, a non-for-profit service provider. All of these numbers are basically describing our case study and basically describing the client. But I think the biggest key takeaway is probably the problem area or the problem statement with this org, which is likely the problem statement with a lot of organizations, which is visibility. The biggest challenge that they had with their, just general visibility is both on the vulnerability side where they had vulnerabilities, they had a vulnerability scanner, they had actually multiple vulnerability scanners, but they didn't really have a good view of what the threat was or how the threats compiled upon each other as these, vulnerabilities would enumerate. And then same goes for the, for the risk management side, to where transitioning from one platform to another, and then trying to find those blind spots within that transition, and then getting over to where it's now much more of a unified situation, to where the vulnerabilities and threats have some visibility, and then also with the policies and compliance that IRM holds up to, how that's all contained and merged together into a much more of a holistic view.
Yeah, I think to add to that, Daniel, you mentioned inefficiencies in their SecOps process, inefficiencies in not accounting for all the vulnerabilities, security incidents that they were capturing. To complement that piece, we learned that there were a lot of manual, antiquated processes in spreadsheets, in SharePoint sites, things I'm sure you guys can relate to as you're listening to this, where not everything is in a consolidated central space. So now your reporting suffers from that, your decision-making suffers from that. So we wanted to help our client consolidate a lot of their key data sources into ServiceNow, such as policy management, such as compliance management, issues management, et cetera, along with the SecOps suite. So consolidating all that vital information so that they can make key decisions at the leadership level.
So let's talk about some of the key drivers that they had along with the problem statement that was described here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned, they were using a lot of legacy tools. They had an antiquated GRC system. They wanted to move to ServiceNow. They were already using it for ITSM, but they wanted to use it now for IRM and SecOps. So firstly, they wanted to improve the efficiencies and standardizing the policy lifecycle management. So taking a policy all the way from draft, all the way to published, They had a lot of NERC policies, a lot of PCI policies, vulnerability policies that were sitting in SharePoint. They wanted to move those over into a ServiceNow platform and manage those with the proper audit trails behind them, notifications, and workflows. They were also doing some components of cyber audit testing. So not necessarily third line audit, but more so cyber audit testing such that it gives them an informed information around the controls that are in place against their cyber program and having visibility into those. Similar to their policy program, a lot of their controls were sitting in spreadsheets, sitting in different sources where they could not make the best use of that data and make information-based decisions off of those. They also wanted to group their assets. So ServiceNow uses the GRC profiling sort of use case to group assets in the CMDB, whether they're IT or business, to be able to then apply your controls and risk frameworks to. That was something that was lacking. So there wasn't a rationalization or a common controls library that they had. So they were doing a compliance for the sake of compliance, right? Redundancy in testing where they couldn't say, based off of testing one control, we're crossing off all these different regulations. So we helped them achieve that through the use of an integration with NIST RMF and NIST CSF. In addition, integrated risk assessments that not only inform what's the IT risk posture, but also what are the vulnerable items that are coming to the organization and how do they then feed into the risk register from the various risk assessments that are taking place.
So with that, we continue on with, it almost gets to a graduated scale as we get to these numbers here. Now we're getting to wanting to create an end-to-end capability to where not only are they seeing the vulnerabilities from the discovery side, but they're also seeing how they handle within, how it works within, remediation, how do we deal with exceptions, and how do we deal with false positives. Now, the key one here is exceptions, where that can actually dovetail into policy and compliance reporting, and a lot of awareness that has to happen to where something that is not remediated at an immediate time or within an SLA, we need to do something about that. There has to be a report that includes and helps with that. So it dovetails into consistency with compliance and self-reporting. A lot of the frameworks that were built into where we talked about in step 2 and step 3, enhancing those to where now it's a workflow. Now it's repeatable. Now it's consistent. So we have that built and engineered in that as well. And then my favorite is always the improvement of the CMDB. So we'll go into another slide where we talk a little bit about the architecture, which is basically my favorite slide. But within the improvement of the CMDB, you have 2 feeds where the IRM entities and all of the data that's coming from the GRC side of the house, and then you have the discovery side where not only do you talk about vulnerability management, vulnerability scanning, but you can also talk about the rest of your security tools when it comes to discovery and monitoring. So a lot of that enhancement helps with the CMDB and getting better data and better affiliation to what you're looking at and what you're defending against. And then finally, the integration, which we talked about a little bit. Again, we'll go into that within the architecture view, the VR tools, and then the data relationships that go into IRM to where you have the vulnerability, but within the enumeration of vulnerabilities or the threats they're in, how does that relay into the risk management profile?
So when you have a mandate by an organization to transform your integrated risk management program, that cannot begin without first setting a program vision. Why are we doing this? And as time passes, are we still doing it for the right reasons, right? So establishing a program vision is key. That program vision has to be supported by proper governance and a set of guiding principles that make sure that as new functional teams onboard the platform, as additional regulatory changes come forth, business needs change, as you design and scale the platform and the integrated risk management program, you're doing so in such a way that it's sustainable over time. Governance is a key buzzword that gets thrown around a lot of days, but what does that actually mean, right? Governance for our client meant that having the right executive sponsorship, it meant having the budget and resource allocation prioritized for this initiative, and everybody speaking the same language. I think this would resonate with a lot of you in the audience, which is at your organizations, terms like risks, terms like issues can get conflated, right? You can refer to a risk as an issue as a risk, and that definition isn't clearly known So you're speaking different languages, your skills are off, you're measuring things in perhaps different ways across different functional units. And that is key in program governance, right? You have to be able to have the data measured and quantified in a consistent way so that your reports clearly articulate what your risk posture is, what your compliance posture is, so that you're making the right decisions for your organization. So think of guiding principles, lending itself from the program vision. Guiding principles, think of them as, bumper rails at a bowling alley, right? They protect the organization for kind of coming off course, specifically when it comes to setting up an IRM program. So for our client, the key guiding principles were, firstly, focusing on efficiency. What does that mean? Focusing on efficiency for our client meant, leveraging out-of-the-box principles as much as possible, or near-the-box principles as much as possible, right? You want to tailor the platform to some degree for your own requirements, but you don't want to alter the out-of-the-box workflows. ServiceNow is such a great platform. It has such sort of robust workflow capabilities, notification capabilities. We want to make sure that we're adhering and leveraging that as much as possible to avoid customization and preventing ourselves from downstream, down the line platform upgrades that may prevent us from, reaping the benefits of what ServiceNow brings in things like Tokyo and other future releases. So focusing on efficiency. It's then executed by our planning and delivery, so agility in planning and delivery. And that means that while there's going to be so much excitement in using a new tool, all these teams are going to be interested in getting all their requirements in, getting essentially stood up from day one so they can perform business as usual activities. Agility in planning for our client meant like, hey, let's focus on the minimal viable product. What do we need to get going on day one? And then how do we mature that and enhance that over time? So that means we capture our requirements, but then we prioritize them and groom our product backlog so that we're agile in our planning and agile in our delivery. And that delivery is supported by active participation in change. That means for our client, keeping an open mind, right? They sought out KPMG as advisors to guide them towards industry-leading practices, what Daniel and myself, have seen over multiple implementations on how to stand up IRM programs. We guided them like, hey, let's keep an open mind. Your processes today, yeah, they're doing well, but there are some redundancies here. There's some efficiencies that we can gain. And we infused our accelerators and our perspectives from KPMG to guide them towards a newer way of thinking. And kudos to them, right? They kept an open mind. They were proactive in the change that they wanted to see. So there was a lot of collaboration amongst the different functional leads from the SecOps side and the GRC side to make sure that whatever change that they were undergoing was perceived as a positive. Change can oftentimes be threatening or can be seen as a negative. They did a great job in keeping an open mind and being flexible in their thinking.
So fun thing about this client here is that our meetings tended to get larger and larger and larger within the engagement because of that active participation, because there was, once people started understanding that the requirements were being mapped in, they started getting skin in the game. So, when we get into, all of our big Zoom calls, there's, 20 or so folks, but it's really, we actually also had to kind of tamper it down to where it's like, okay, all the tech guys, we'll talk to you later. All of the, all the main stakeholders, we'll get back to you as well.
That's a good problem to have, right? Like oftentimes, and I'm sure you guys, when you get on your work meetings, you can hear a pin drop. There's not a lot of perspectives, not a lot of viewpoints. And in a program like this, such a change that's the organizations that are going, to have that many people excited and wanting to give their input, that's a blessing. It's a good problem to have. So from change, change is much easier to digest when there is intuitiveness and simplicity in whatever you're trying to implement. ServiceNow is great in that it's already intuitive to begin with. So as you implement your workflows, as you implement your processes, you want to make sure that you want to minimize clicks. You want to make sure that you're not jumping from screen to screen. So simplicity in your design and intuitiveness in your design is a key driver of that change. If you keep the business user always in mind, like, hey, if they were to walk into ServiceNow or executing a process in ServiceNow, how much guidance would they need? And the answer should be minimal to none, right? An end user should be able to come in, see what work needs to be done, complete the work, and get out. And then lastly, efficiency is great, agility and planning is great, change management is great, the simple design is great, but ultimately none of that matters if you don't have people that are accountable for the work that they're responsible for completing. And this was enacted upon by Daniel and myself by enhancing their CMDB, collecting the key attributes that are necessary to be able to comply risk framework, or to assign risk frameworks to assign control frameworks to. And from a vulnerability side, I'm sure you have a similar story, right,
Yeah,
Daniel?
items and groups, and then groups to well, now they're remediation tabs.
Yep.
But yeah, no, it gets very real when we start looking at groups and users and roles, to where once they start identifying that I am in this group and this ownership, to where the logical groups that are within the ServiceNow ecosystem, now it turns into the real deal, to where yes, you are on the clock to either figure out if this is a false positive or something to remediate within your remediation groups, or within the policy side, within the compliance side, who that's assigned to. So it gets really real after step 5.
Yeah, that's a big thing, right? A lot of their CMDB assets lacked ownership. How can you drive accountability if people don't know that they own something, right? So the first thing we did was like, hey, let's try and get as much ownership behind the key assets, behind the key risks, policies, vulnerable items, et cetera, so that accountability is achieved. You're meeting your SLAs, you're meeting your deadlines that you need to meet. So accountability was their last and perhaps most important principle within their IRM program.
So we get to my favorite slide. This is usually, again, for the engineers and for the architects, this is where it all kind of comes together. So in regards to the management architecture, I could boil this down. We could take another 30 minutes to just knock this out as far as this one slide. But we'll keep it very simple and common, to where it comes from two ends. It comes from the IRM side, to where all of the entities and activities that are done within those modules and those applications as well, to where it starts enhancing things from the get-go. Again, if it starts, from a manual process or from an automated process of bringing in data for that, that's actually a good starting point, to where, bringing in that enrichment data from IRM gets you to a good start, to where you can start feeling that and seeing that connection between security operations and IRM. Now, on the other side, it's the third-party side. Again, as we mentioned before, the driver within our client was multiple vulnerability scanners, not just one, but multiple scanners, agent and agentless, multiple environments, cloud on-prem, all of it. So a lot of that driver to bring in that vulnerability data was mainly from the vulnerability scanners. But again, the manual incidents, the detection tools that still have all of that vulnerability data and also have asset data, whether it's part of the CMDB, whether it resolves to a CI, or if it becomes unresolved or an unmatched CI, that information definitely comes in from the scanner as well, with the attributes, IPs, MACs, all that good stuff, to where you're starting to get more of a build inside of VR, to where now you start enumerating the risk. I have X amount of items within VR that groups into one single item because it's one asset that's involved. Well, what is the, what type of compliance is this asset involved in? Is this part of an environment that is, SOX? Is it part of PCI? What is it? So that's where that connectivity really starts getting ingrained into the whole process. Where you're seeing related items and related records inside of VR, and you're seeing that inside of IRM stating that, well, we might have some issues here, to where it has to be something that needs to be resolved sooner rather than later because of its high compliance or its high visibility.
Yeah, I think the word integrated, right? Like for me, I'm a visual learner. I'm sure many of you guys are too. Like when I hear the word integrated and I think of IRM and SecOps, those two worlds colliding into one, sure, you can explain it to me conceptually and I'll get it. But I think an illustration like this really helps emphasize and visualize what exactly that means. So you'll notice that Daniel was speaking to a lot of the SecOps modules in the middle of the screen. But then right over to the right, you've got ServiceNow IRM, right? And that speaks to the fact that whatever vulnerable items exist, whatever security incidents exist against particular IT assets, ultimately they're measured against what controls are mapped to those IT assets or business assets, what risks are present, and how they're constantly being assessed and mitigated over time to reduce the overall exposure to your organization. So I think something like this really helps bring that integrated message home that oftentimes can get lost just by speaking to it. Having a visual like this really helps in developing that understanding.
Yeah, and if we want to get into any more additional details, we have a booth in the expo hall, so we can get into that much more in detail.
So our transformation journey, right? We talked about, we helped our client firstly develop overall program vision. We put forth a set of guiding principles. We established their governance model. And then from there, we said, all right, let's get to work. And that work began with firstly developing an implementation roadmap. And this is essentially a executive summary type view of that implementation roadmap. And what that did for our client was help them prioritize the capabilities that are firstly most important. What are the minimal viable capabilities we need to have stood up on day one to complete our most critical business activities? It began with the implementation roadmap. We divided it up across an 18-month flow, 0 to 6 months, 7 to 12, and then 12 onwards. Following the implementation roadmap, we then stood up policy management and compliance management. So standing up their policy lifecycle, being able to take let's say a vulnerability response policy all the way from draft all the way to finish, publish that on the knowledge base so that your end user can retrieve it. As I mentioned previously, it was in Excel, it was in Word documents, it was in SharePoint. People weren't even aware what policies existed in the organization or where to get them. It was sort of common knowledge amongst the second line or the functional teams that we're working with, but beyond that, the first line had no sort of larger visibility into where those policies sat. So standing up policy management was step 2, along with compliance management. Standing up a foundational self-assessment capability against particular controls that the first line is responsible for, and then setting up some basic indicators that automate and reduce the manpower that's needed to do that day-to-day testing. So policy management and compliance management, followed by risk management and issues management. So standing up a foundational risk assessment lifecycle, taking a risk against a particular asset, taking it all the way from assess to monitor, and doing that continuous monitoring. That's essential. And again, automating and using the ServiceNow platform to reduce a lot of the perhaps inefficiencies or manual work that is existing today for our client.
Now with stop 4, it's good that we have stop 4 as in where vulnerability response lies, mainly because of the dependency within policy and compliance management. The connectivity between vulnerabilities that are discovered and then the review and the research of exceptions. That's where it becomes very, very important that policy and compliance is installed in tandem with VR. So whenever those exceptions do get reported, there is a straight path, an inline path to create that exception, create an exception record, and point it directly to policy and compliance for review and for continued monitoring. Now there is definitely a time cap on those things, so that's where the SLAs and the time sensitivity with each of those records, the exception record and the vulnerability record, really comes into play. And again, within the vision, that's where all of that activity is built out. So in regards to the dashboards and reports, so again, visibility was the massive problem statement that we had to solve for. So within the enumeration of vulnerabilities from multiple scanners and then all of the reporting that needed to happen in regards to sending them off to the right teams at the right time, and then the SLAs that were impacted by that activity, that's where those dashboards need to be built on that vulnerability response end right there. So, executive reports, when it comes to scheduled reports, anything that needs to be automated at a cadence or any sort of specific timeframes, that's where that was built in, along with kind of the tail end for the rest of IRM to include the vulnerability data within those reporting.
Yeah, I want to come back to stop 3, and if you look at it, its position relative to the roadmap. It's right in the middle. It's after policy and compliance management, but before vulnerability response and security incident response. And the reason we prioritized this way with the client was because we talked about earlier how risks and issues can be interchangeable or confused within organizations. Daniel, you and I think we're on a workshop when you asked them, how would you define an issue? Or how would you define a risk? And there were competing answers where one person was saying, everything is a risk, versus not having a clear definition of an issue is something that happened, risk is something that could happen, and how you treat both of those things differs. Risk treatment differs from issues management, sort of closure or remediation. And what we did in STOP 3 was essentially make those two processes distinct in the organization, which did not exist when we first arrived there. So it's essentially enabling the treatment of risk through mitigation activities, transferring to an insurance policy if that exists, risk acceptance, which is different from policy exception, which is necessary as well. So, essentially creating the distinction between those two processes, and then standing up issues management so that if something has occurred, a deficiency in your control is present, a event has occurred, how do you remediate it, or how you create an exception for it if you don't have the means to fix it at the time being. So I think that's an important thing to call out, just as sort of a middle piece that glues everything together.
So as far as 6, 7, and 8, those are much more on the, that straddles that expansion and the operationalization and optimization as well. Because, within our client, they valued and they prioritized vulnerability management and vulnerability response prior to security incident response. No wrong answers. The teams can, organizations can prioritize whichever one that they'd like. In this case study, however, the exceptions and the risk and the issues that were all consolidated within the reporting within vulnerability response was prioritized. So within the expansion, SIR would finally have that connective tissue with VR to where instead of having the regular cadence of vulnerability management, you can literally hit a panic button and start on your incident response activity if the finding was so intense. Now, in regards to the audit management, that was another extended portion to where the previous modules and the previous applications were included beforehand.
Yeah, absolutely. So, audit management is something that they're striving towards. They do some capacity of cyber audit testing. However, it's not pure third line. They were using another platform by the time we got there. However, just due to the success of our implementation and the way we charted the path for them, they're strongly considering not only integrating the two platforms, but also a slow transition over into ServiceNow altogether to have, again, all that data in a centralized location.
So the resiliency part is definitely much more on the optimization end. We're taking in all of the data from all of the applications and all the modules themselves and building any sort of business impact and disaster recovery to where now we've got it all standardized with all of the information unified and telling us exactly what we need to know. The other additional steps, though, as well, within crisis management, again, more of an extension of what happens within SecOps, but still dovetails nicely into what we need to report within risk, especially after action and lessons learned within that activity. And then the automation countermeasures, definitely a big feature within SecOps to where we're now automating responses and tasks where we're taking care of the countermeasures from a task perspective where that's already being done by tools and platforms that should be doing it anyway. You should be blocking sites that are malicious. You should be cleaning things up that are low commodity level malware. So, and then also that VR component to where, hey, we should be patching this. We're already scheduled to patch this. This vulnerability should be patched, in that certain cadence.
Yeah. So, what are some key takeaways that Daniel and I can give you guys as you walk away from our session? Firstly, there has to be agreement with your client or even within your organization that what we're about to undertake, a transformation journey of our IRM program, has to begin with an agreed upon vision. As I mentioned earlier in the session, that vision has to endure time. As regulatory changes are presented, as business needs change, that program vision should be scalable so that it accommodates all your needs over time. So having that vision in place, having agility in your planning and your delivery, that's then stood up by a set of guiding principles and the proper governance.
And then finally, as we saw within the roadmap and within all of the discussions here, it's going to be a phased approach. Rome cannot be built in a day with these two components. It has to be definitely taken into account prioritization. What is the more pressing thing and what is the driver for your client or for the client that's involved. And then, going through to where there is definitely going to be a first release, a foundational release to where things are stood up. and then moving towards operationalization. And then the optimization continues on to where you're adding enhancements, you're adding more data, you're adding possibly another additional third-party tools and reports. So all of that does definitely compile into, you got to take it step by step.
So on behalf of KPMG, I'm Issa.
I'm Daniel.
If you want, we're going to be at our KPMG booth. We welcome all questions. Love to see you guys' faces come by. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you all.